She had spent years standing in his shadow, silent, loyal, invisible. But the day she discovered the truth, the woman who had given everything finally had nothing left to lose. If this story stays with you, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me, because this is where it begins. Gisette. The ultrasound photo was still warm from the printer. Amara Bennett Kang stood outside Seoul General Hospital and held it with both hands, careful the way you'd hold something that could shatter. The image was small, grainy, black and white, barely more than a smudge on paper. But she had stared at it so long in the examination room that she'd memorized every curve of it. The doctor's voice was still echoing somewhere in the back of her skull. Approximately 7 weeks. Strong heartbeat. Everything looks healthy. She hadn't cried in the office. She'd held it together long enough to nod and smile and sign the paperwork and make the follow-up appointment. But now she was standing on the pavement in the October air, with cars streaming past and strangers brushing her shoulders, and she was shaking. Not from cold, from the weight of it. 7 years. That's how long they had been trying, in the quiet way couples try when they're too proud to admit how much it's hurting. Specialist consultations that Jae-hyun attended exactly twice before his schedule became impossible. Injections she gave herself in the bathroom with the door locked so she didn't have to see his face when they didn't work. Months where her hope felt like a bruise she kept pressing. And now, this small smudge of a heartbeat that no one else in the world knew about yet. She was going to tell them tonight. She had already planned it. She'd stop at the market near their apartment building, buy the ingredients for the doenjang guy he'd eaten every birthday since he was a child. The recipe she'd spent 3 weeks learning from his housekeeper before the woman retired. She'd set the table properly. Light candles. Wait until he'd eaten and softened before sliding the photo across to him. She wanted to watch his face when he understood. For the first time in years, Amara Bennett Kang allowed herself to believe that the hardest part of her marriage was finally behind them. She was still holding that thought when she saw him. Jae-hyun was across the street, maybe 40 meters away, standing beside a black SUV with the rear door open. He was wearing the charcoal suit he'd left in that morning. She recognized the cut of the shoulders, the particular way he stood, weight shifted slightly to one side, jaw set. She'd memorized his posture the same way she'd memorized every other thing about him over a decade. She almost called out, her mouth even opened. Then she saw the woman. She was being helped into the vehicle by Jae-hyun himself, his hand at the small of her back, steady and careful in a way that Amara recognized as deliberate. You didn't touch someone like that unless you touched them many times before. The woman moved slowly, one hand braced on the doorframe, and when she turned, Amara saw her profile clearly. The high cheekbones, the expensive coat open at the front, and beneath it, unmistakable even at this distance, the rounded belly of a woman at least 7 months pregnant, Yoona Choi. Amara knew the name. She'd heard it for 3 years. My assistant, she handles the logistics for the Eastern District. She's very efficient. And she'd seen her exactly twice at organization functions where Jae-hyun kept the 2 women in the same room the way you keep 2 circuit breakers from touching. Amara had never felt threatened by her. She'd felt nothing because Jae-hyun had given her no reason to look. She stood on the pavement and watched her husband close the car door behind his pregnant mistress, watched him walk around to the front passenger side and speak briefly to the driver through the window, watched him pull out his phone and type something with his thumb. His face was unreadable at this distance. It was always unreadable. That was one of the first things she'd learned about him, that he had trained his expressions the way other people trained muscles, until nothing showed unless he allowed it. The car pulled away. Amara didn't move. She stood there until the SUV disappeared around a corner, and then she looked down at the ultrasound photo still in her hands and felt something she didn't have a word for yet. It wasn't grief, not quite. It was the sensation of a floor dropping out from under you. That half second between losing your footing and hitting the ground where your body doesn't know yet what's about to happen to it. She folded the photo carefully, put it in her coat pocket, and followed him. Fuck. She'd always known, in the abstract way that wives of powerful men know things, that Jae-hyun's world was not clean. The Black Phoenix organization was 40 years old, built first by his uncle and then restructured by Jae-hyun in his late 20s into something more surgical and less visible. They didn't call themselves anything, The name lived in law enforcement files, and in the way certain businessmen in Gangnam went quiet when Kang Jae-hyun entered a room. He controlled import infrastructure along 3 port corridors, a network of hospitality businesses that served as financial architecture, and enough political relationships to make investigations expensive for the investigators. Amara had not walked into this blind. She'd chosen him knowing what he was, which was perhaps the most honest thing she'd ever done in her life, acknowledging that she loved a man whose hands were not entirely his own. What she had not chosen was this. She took a cab and gave the driver instructions and watched the city pass outside the window with a strange, dissociated calm. Seoul moved around her the way it always did. Dense and noisy and stratified, the old neighborhoods bleeding into the new money, the neon signs competing with the construction cranes. She had come here at 22 on a graduate exchange program and stayed because of a man, which was the kind of decision that looked different depending on which end of it you were standing on. The cab dropped her 2 blocks from the address she'd given, a residential district in Seongbuk-gu she'd never visited, the kind of area where old trees grew over the walls and the houses sat back from the street, and privacy was something the neighborhood was designed around. She walked the rest of the way. She found the house, not a house, a private residence, 4 floors of pale stone behind electronic gates, the kind of structure that cost more than some companies. The black SUV was parked inside the gate. The driver was gone. She stood outside for a long time. She wasn't sure what she was waiting for. Confirmation, maybe. Or the courage to leave before she got it. She got neither. What she got was 40 minutes of nothing, and then the front door opening and Yoona Choi coming out alone onto the small terrace, moving carefully the way heavily pregnant women move, one hand resting on the rail, and standing there in the evening air like she owned the view, because she did own the view, or at least the man who'd paid for it had decided she did. Amara pushed the gate intercom before she finished thinking about whether to. The sound it made was soft. Yoona looked up, looked across, and her expression, when she recognized Amara, went through 3 things in rapid succession. Surprise, then calculation, then something that wasn't quite amusement but was close enough to make Amara's stomach clench. The gate buzzed open. The inside of the house smelled like money and fresh paint. Someone had furnished it recently and expensively and without any particular personality, the kind of space that said I was purchased rather than I was lived in. Yoona led her to a sitting room with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over a terraced garden, and she sat down on the sofa with the slow, careful movements of a woman who had learned to perform her pregnancy like a performance, and she gestured at the chair across from her. "You can sit," she said. Her Korean was soul-polished, the vowels clipped and certain. Amara didn't sit. "How long?" she said. Yoona tilted her head. "Does it matter?" "Answer me." Yoona looked at her for a moment with that almost amusement still working at the corners of her mouth, and then she said, 14 months. 14 months. Amara ran the math without meaning to. Names, dates, events. The company retreat in Busan where Jae-hyun came back quieter than he left. The 3-day trip to Jeju he'd taken alone for negotiations. The period last winter when he'd stopped reaching for her in their bed, and she had told herself it was stress, because the alternative was something she hadn't been ready to look at. "He bought this house for me," Yoona said. She said it the way you'd state a fact at a business meeting. No heat in it, no cruelty, just precision. "He moved me in 4 months ago. When I told him I was pregnant, he's been very attentive. He has a wife." "He has a marriage," Yoona said. "That's not the same thing. You know that." She looked at Amara with something that might have been pity if it had been accompanied by any warmth. "You've been trying for 7 years, haven't you? He told me. He said he didn't want to hurt you, but that he'd accepted you weren't able to give him—" Stop. What he needed. An heir. It's important to him, more than you understood, I think. The organization requires— I said stop. The word came out flat and hard, and Yoona stopped, not because she was frightened, but because something in Amar's face had shifted into a register that warranted caution. They looked at each other across the bright, expensive room, and the silence lasted exactly long enough. Then Amara heard footsteps in the hallway. Jae-hyun appeared in the doorway. He took in the scene in the way he took in everything, instantly, completely, without expression. His eyes moved from Yoona to Amara and stayed there. He hadn't expected this. That was the only thing Amara could read on his face, the absence of preparation. Amara, he said, how long were you going to let this continue? It wasn't a question. Her voice was steady. She was surprised by how steady it was, considering that her hands inside her coat pockets were shaking hard enough to crumple the ultrasound photo she was still holding. You need to go home, he said. Answer me. This isn't the place. This is exactly the place. She heard her voice go sharp and she didn't pull it back. You moved her into a house. She's 7 months pregnant. 7 months, Yehyun. And you stood in front of me this morning and told me your meetings would run late, and I believed you, because I always believed you, because I was an absolute fool. His jaw moved, some old practiced control running beneath the surface. Lower your voice. She told me you said I couldn't give you children. She watched something flicker through his eyes. Was that true? Is that what you told her? Silence. Say it to my face, Amara said. If you're going to use me as your excuse, at least say it to my face. Yuna spoke from the sofa, softly, careful in a way that was its own kind of weapon. Jae-hyun, maybe she should know about what the doctor said. Your doctor's assessment after your last consultation. Yuna. His voice stopped her, clean and hard. He looked at her, and she subsided. Then he looked back at Amara, and for one moment, just one, something real moved through his face. Not guilt exactly, something older and less legible than guilt. The face of a man who had made a calculation a long time ago and was now standing in the arithmetic of it. I'm sorry you found out this way, he said. Amara laughed. It came out of her before she could catch it. Short and ugly, nothing like the way she usually laughed. That's what you have for me. Amara, I'm pregnant. The words fell into the room like something dropped from a height. She watched them hit him. She watched Yuna's head come up sharply. She hadn't meant to say it, or maybe she had. Some part of her that had walked through that gate with the photo folded in her pocket had known exactly when it would come out, had known she would say it here, in this room, in front of both of them, because there was something almost medieval about the justice of it. Jaehyun didn't move. He stood very still in the doorway, and she could see him working through it. The math of it, the implications of it, the way it rearranged everything he'd built in the last 14 months. Yuna spoke first. That's not possible. 7 weeks, Amara said. She pulled the photo from her pocket and held it up, and her hand wasn't shaking anymore. I found out 2 hours ago. I was coming home to tell you. She looked at Jaehyun when she said the last word. She kept looking at him. I had the whole evening planned. His mouth opened, closed. Tell me, Amara said very quietly, that you believe me. What happened next was something she would turn over in her mind for a long time afterward, examining it from different angles, trying to find the version of it that made sense. Jaehyun looked at her. Then he looked at Yuna. And Yuna, very calmly, from the sofa, said, She knew you'd be here today. She must have prepared this. She's been carrying that photo in her pocket for a reason. The silence stretched, and Jaehyun said nothing. That was the thing. He said nothing. He didn't defend her. He didn't tell Yuna to stop. He stood in the doorway of the house he'd bought for his mistress, and he looked at his wife and he said absolutely nothing, which was its own kind of answer, the most devastating kind, because it required no words at all. Amara lowered her hand. She looked at the photo once more. She put it back in her pocket. Jaehyun. Her voice came out very even. She didn't know how. I walked past you every morning for 7 years and I never once doubted you. You need to understand that. I never looked for this because I trusted you completely. I want you to know that about yourself, about what you had and what you chose to do with it. She turned toward the door. She heard him say her name. She didn't stop. The hallway was longer than she remembered. Her footsteps were very loud on the stone floor. She reached the front door and pushed it open and stepped out into the evening air, and her legs were working fine. Everything was working fine. She was completely fine, she told herself, all the way down the front steps and through the gate and onto the pavement where the street lamps were just beginning to come on and the neighborhood was very quiet. She made it half a block. Then her legs stopped. She stood on the pavement in the darkening street with her hand pressed flat against the stone wall of a house that wasn't hers, breathing in and breathing out, and she let the shaking come because there was no longer any reason to stop it. It moved through her in waves, Not crying, not yet. Something before crying, something more physical and less voluntary. She pressed her other hand over her coat pocket where the photo was. She did not hear him come up behind her. She heard Yuna's voice first, elevated, carrying from somewhere back near the gate, and then a sharp sound, the kind of sound that doesn't announce itself before it happens. And then the pavement came up to meet her, and the last thing she understood, before the dark, was the warmth of the photo still folded in her pocket, and the distant sound of Jae-hyun's voice finally saying her name. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and recycled air, and something underneath both of those things that Amara couldn't name but recognized as the smell of a place where bad news was delivered routinely enough that the walls had absorbed it. She came back to consciousness in pieces. First the light, white and flat and merciless. Then the sounds, the soft percussion of a monitor somewhere to her left, the distant shuffle of footsteps in a corridor, the particular silence of a room that had recently contained people who'd left when they heard her stirring. Then the pain, which wasn't sharp the way she'd expected, but dull and low and central, the kind of pain that doesn't announce itself dramatically because it's already done what it came to do. She knew before the doctor told her. The way you know certain things in your body before your mind gets there, she knew from the quality of the pain, from the specific emptiness of it, from the way the nurse looked at her chart and then at the floor when Amar's eyes tracked to her face. She knew, and knowing it didn't make the words any less brutal when the doctor said them. "I'm very sorry, Mrs. Kang. The trauma caused a placental abruption. We were unable to—" She stopped hearing after a point, not because she fainted or dissociated, but because the sentence had already completed itself inside her before he finished it, and everything after was just sound. She lay in the white room and looked at the ceiling. She did not cry. She noted this about herself the way you'd note a fact about a stranger. She did not cry. Her hands were folded on the blanket over her stomach, and she kept them there, pressing lightly, as if something might still be there to protect. The doctor left. The nurse left. The monitor continued its soft percussion. The door opened again 20 minutes later, and she turned her head, expecting a nurse with forms, and found Lee Min-seok standing in the doorway instead. She hadn't seen him in almost 2 years. He looked largely the same. The clean-cut jaw, the careful posture, the quality of his clothes that suggested money without announcing it. He'd cut his hair shorter since she'd last seen him. He was holding a paper cup of something hot, and he looked at her across the room with an expression she didn't have the energy to decode. "Who told you?" she said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected, disused. "The hospital has you listed under your legal name," he said. "Kang Amara Bennett. You're still in the alumni system under Bennett. A colleague of mine saw your name in the admissions register." He didn't move from the doorway. "I can leave if you want." She looked at him for a moment. "Is there anyone else outside?" Something moved through his eyes. "No." She turned back to the ceiling. "Then don't leave." He came in and sat in the chair beside the bed. Not close, not leaning in, just present in the way that certain people are present, filling a room without pressing on it. He set the paper cup on the bedside table. She didn't ask what it was. They sat in silence for a long time, and the monitor kept its rhythm, and the corridor outside kept its distant shuffle, and neither of them said anything, which was exactly the right thing. Eventually she said, "I lost the baby." "I know," he said quietly. "I spoke to someone at the desk. I found out I was pregnant 2 hours before it happened." She said it to the ceiling. "I was going to surprise him." Min-seok said nothing. She appreciated that he didn't fill the silence with condolences, which would have required her to receive them. "He didn't come," she said. A pause. "I know that too. He knows I'm here. Someone from the gate. One of Yuna's household staff, I think. They would have called him. He knows." She turned her head and looked at Min-seok directly for the first time. "He didn't come." Min-seok held her gaze. His face was very controlled, but there was something working underneath it. Something she would have called anger on anyone else, but on him it was too quiet for that word. "No," he said. "He didn't." She turned back to the ceiling. "I want to file for divorce," she said. He didn't react with surprise. He said, "Okay." "I don't know how to do it without his organization knowing. His lawyers are... They're embedded in everything, every account, every contract. I signed things when we married that I didn't fully understand and I was too trusting to push back on. And now, Amara. His voice was gentle but direct. One thing at a time. She looked at him again. He was leaning forward slightly in the chair now, elbows on his knees, the paper cup forgotten. The monitor beeped between them. "Why are you here?" she said. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. He considered the question like it deserved consideration. "Because I was in the city," he said. "And because you shouldn't be alone right now. And because—" He stopped. Started again. "Because some things don't require a complicated reason." She looked at him for a long moment, then she looked away. "Don't do anything," she said. "Whatever you're thinking, don't. I don't need a rescue. I just need to get out of this hospital and find somewhere to go that isn't his apartment." "I understand," he said. She believed him. That was the thing about Min-suk, had always been the thing about him, going back to university, going back to the years when she'd known him as a peripheral figure in her life, pleasant and undemanding and always slightly further away than he needed to be. She'd never understood why he kept that distance. She'd assumed it was simply his temperament. She was beginning to revise that assumption. Jae-hyun came to the hospital the following morning. She knew he was coming before he arrived because the quality of the nurse's behavior changed. A certain quickening, a certain careful neutrality that people adopted around men whose names carried weight. He came with 2 members of his organization waiting in the corridor, and he came alone into the room, which she thought was meant to communicate something about good faith, and he stood at the foot of her bed and looked at her. He looked tired. She noted it without sympathy, and then felt something small and involuntary move in her chest at the noting of it, and hated herself for that half-second of residual care. "How are you feeling?" he said. "Don't," she said. His jaw tightened. He pulled the chair away from the bed and sat in it, which surprised her. She'd expected him to stand, to maintain the height of it. He sat and put his hands on his knees and looked at the floor between them. "I should have come last night," he said. "Yes. There was a situation with the pregnancy, she had some bleeding, and He stopped. She watched him stop himself, watched him hear his own words and understand them. "You stayed with her," Amara said. "Your pregnant mistress had some bleeding, so you stayed with her, while your wife lost her baby in a hospital 2 kilometers away." She said it without inflection, the way you'd read a document aloud. "That's what happened." He didn't answer. "I want a divorce," she said. He looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed in a way she'd never seen before. Not from crying, she thought, but from the specific exhaustion of a man who had not slept and was sitting inside the consequences of himself. "Amara, I've already contacted a lawyer, not yours, mine." She had done this from the hospital bed that morning, on Min-suk's phone, through a contact Min-suk had offered without being asked. "I'm not negotiating, I'm not waiting, I want it done." "It's not that simple. The organization, I don't care about the organization. The financial structure of the marriage is, I don't want anything from you." She heard her own voice go very cold and stayed with it. "I want out. That's all. No claims, no settlements, no extended litigation. I sign what I need to sign, and I leave, and we are done." He stared at her. "You're not serious." "Jae-hyun," she said, his name like a door closing. "I was pregnant. I came to find you to tell you that, because I actually believed standing on that street that this was going to save us somehow, that this was the thing that was going to matter enough to—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "And instead I found out who you are. Not the version of you I invented in my head over 10 years. The real version. The man who stood in that room and said nothing while a woman called me a liar in front of him. The man who didn't come." The monitor beeped. "I lost our child," she said. "And you weren't here." He flinched. It was small and quickly controlled, but she saw it, and she filed it away with everything else she was filing away. Not for use, not as ammunition, just as true things she needed to keep, because there was a version of herself that had almost convinced herself none of this was real. "I didn't know," he said, "about the pregnancy. I didn't believe—" He stopped. "No," she said. "You didn't believe me. You believed her. In your own house, with your wife standing in front of you, you believed her." She looked at him steadily. "That's the marriage we had, Jae-hyun. That's what 10 years looked like at the end of it." He was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, Seoul moved in its ordinary morning way. Traffic, construction, the faint sound of a delivery truck reversing somewhere below. Normal sounds from a city that didn't know or care about this room. "Where will you go?" he said finally. "That's not your concern anymore." He stood up. He moved to the window and stood with his back to her, which she'd seen him do 1,000 times, retreat into a view when the room became something he couldn't manage. She'd always let him. She'd always waited him out, stood at the center of his silences, and remained available for when he came back. She was done remaining available. "I'll tell my lawyers to cooperate," he said to the window. "No delays, clean separation, like you said." She said nothing. He turned around. His face had reassembled itself into something more familiar. The controlled surface, the jaw set just slightly too hard. "For what it's worth," he said, "what I said to Yuna, what she told you I said, it wasn't—" He stopped. "I never told her you couldn't give me children. I want you to know that." She looked at him. "I told her I was uncertain about the future of the marriage," he said. "That's all." She extrapolated. "And that's supposed to—" She stopped herself, took a breath. "Thank you for clarifying," she said in a voice that communicated exactly what she thought of the clarification. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and didn't turn around. "I know what I had," he said quietly. "I knew it when I had it. I need you to know that I knew." She didn't answer. He left. She stared at the ceiling for a long time after that, and the monitor beeped its small, indifferent rhythm, and she pressed her hands flat against the blanket over her stomach and breathed. She left the hospital 4 days later. Min Seok sent a car. She hadn't asked him to. He'd simply sent a message the morning she was discharged. "Car is downstairs when you're ready. No obligation. Driver will wait." She'd sat with her phone for several minutes looking at the message, and then she'd taken it because the alternative was calling someone from Jae-hyun's network, and she would rather have taken a bus. The driver took her to a building in Mapogu she'd never visited, a high-rise with a lobby that smelled like warm wood and quiet money, understated in the way that things are understated when they've stopped needing to prove themselves. The building manager met her in the lobby and showed her to an apartment on the 14th floor and handed her a key card and said the lease was arranged and the utilities were connected and there was a standing grocery order scheduled for delivery the following morning. She stood in the center of the apartment. Clean lines, high ceilings, a wall of windows looking east over the city, and understood exactly what had happened. She called Min Seok. "The apartment," she said when he picked up. "Yes." "You bought it." A pause. "I arranged the lease." "Min Seok." "You said you needed somewhere that wasn't his," he said. "You didn't say you needed to find it yourself." She stood at the window and looked at Seoul spread out below her and felt a complicated thing move through her chest. Gratitude and resistance and something else that she wasn't going to name yet, that she wasn't in a position to name. "I'm going to pay you back," she said. "Okay," he said. "I mean it. I know you do." His voice was even. "Are you hungry? I can have something sent." "I'm fine." She wasn't. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it, for being there." A pause that lasted exactly long enough. "You don't have to thank me for that," he said. She hung up and stood at the window for a long time and tried to map the person she was now onto the person she'd been 3 weeks ago and found the geography completely unrecognizable. That 3 months passed. The divorce moved through its legal processes with the clean efficiency of 2 parties who had agreed in advance to be done. Jae-hyun's lawyers cooperated. Hers confirmed. Papers moved. Signatures were given. The financial separation was relatively simple because Amara had, true to her word, asked for nothing beyond what she'd brought into the marriage. Her career credentials, her personal accounts, a small inheritance from her maternal grandmother that had always stayed separate. She walked out of this marriage the way she'd almost walked into it, with nothing belonging to him. She found work through her own contacts at a mid-sized consulting firm in Yeouido, then transitioned to a strategic analysis role that suited her training and kept her busy enough that she only thought about the hospital room during the hours between 2 and 4 in the morning, which she'd started filling with reading. She bought plants for the apartment. She learned the walking routes of the Mapo waterfront by heart. She stopped taking the long way home to avoid the street where she'd first seen Yuna. She was in the process of becoming something other than a wound. It was in this process, approximately 3 months after leaving the hospital, in the middle of a Tuesday that had been entirely unremarkable, that she walked into the executive elevator of her company's building and found Lee Min-seok standing in it. He looked at her with the same expression he'd had in the hospital doorway, neither surprised nor unsurprised, just present. He was carrying a briefcase. He was wearing a dark suit and a light tie, and he looked like what he apparently now was, the new executive chairman of Vaughn Korea Holdings, which was, as of 6 weeks ago, the parent company of the consulting firm where Amara worked. She had not known this. "You didn't know," he said. Not a question. He'd read her face. "No?" she said. The elevator doors closed. They were alone. "It was finalized last month," he said. "I would have—" He stopped. "I should have told you." "Yes," she said. "You should have." The elevator hummed between floors. She looked at the lit panel of numbers and did the math. The subsidiary acquisition, the timing, the fact that of the 43 people in her department, she was the one standing in this elevator right now. And she felt something that wasn't quite suspicion, but wasn't far from it. "Did you know I worked here?" she said. "Before the acquisition?" He looked at her for a moment. "Yes." The elevator reached the executive floor and the doors opened and neither of them moved. "Amara," he said. "Was the acquisition about me?" she said. A pause. "The acquisition was about a company with strong fundamentals and a strategically positioned client base," he said. "And yes, I knew you worked here." She stepped out of the elevator. She stopped in the corridor and turned back and looked at him through the open doors. "I'm not fragile," she said. "I want to be clear about that. Whatever you've been doing, the apartment, this, I'm not something that needs to be managed." "I know," he said. "Then stop arranging things around me without telling me." "Okay," he said. The doors began to close. "I'm promoting you," he said through the narrowing gap. "Executive assistant. My office. I need someone who's honest with me, and I trust exactly one person in this building to be that." The doors closed. She stood in the corridor and pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of her nose and breathed. Behind her, from the open office floor, she heard the sound of keyboards and phone calls and the ordinary machinery of a Tuesday, none of which had any idea what was happening to her, and she was grateful for that, for the indifference of ordinary things, for the way life continued its mechanical hum while she stood in the eye of something she hadn't seen coming. She was going to take the job. She already knew she was going to take the job. She wasn't sure yet what that meant, and she wasn't going to figure it out standing in a corridor, so she smoothed her jacket, and she turned around and she walked back to her desk, and she sat down, and she opened her laptop and she started work, because that was the only thing she knew how to do when the ground shifted under. She took the job. She didn't make a ceremony of it. She sent Min-seok a 1-line message that evening. "I'll take the position. Start Monday." And he replied with a single word, "Good." That was the whole negotiation. She appreciated the absence of fanfare. She'd had enough of men who made gestures out of things that should have been simple. The first 2 weeks in the executive suite were an exercise in recalibration. Min-seok's operation ran differently from anything she'd worked in before. Leaner than it looked from the outside, the decision architecture surprisingly flat for a company its size, every senior meeting structured around data she was expected to have already read before she walked in the room. He didn't explain things twice. He didn't soften requests. He handed her a briefing document on her first morning that was 63 pages long and told her he needed her analysis by 3 o'clock, and then left for a conference call without waiting for her response. She had the analysis on his desk by 2:40. He read it while she stood at the window of his office looking out at the Han River, and she heard him turn the pages and heard the small sounds of a person encountering information they found useful, and when he finished, he said, "Page 41, your risk assessment on the Busan subsidiary. Expand that." "How much?" "Until it's complete." She expanded it. He read it. He said, "Good." And that was the whole of it, which was more validating than 3 paragraphs of praise would have been. By the end of the 3rd week, she understood his operation the way she understood things she was built to understand, structurally, from the inside, seeing the load-bearing points and the weak joints simultaneously. She understood why he'd wanted someone he trusted. The company was in a period of consolidation following 3 rapid acquisitions, The organizational layers were still bedding in, and there were people in senior positions whose loyalties were to the previous regime in ways that hadn't fully surfaced yet. She spotted two of them in her first 10 days just by watching how they framed information in meetings. She told Min-suk on a Thursday afternoon. She laid it out plainly. Names, observed behaviors, specific instances of selectively presented data. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "I saw the same thing. I wanted to know if you would." She looked at him. "You were testing me." "I was confirming you," he said. There was a distinction in there she chose to examine later. The work anchored her. That was what she hadn't anticipated. Not the salary, not the status, not even the intellectual engagement, but the simple fact of having somewhere to put her attention for 8 to 10 hours a day that had nothing to do with hospitals or courtrooms or the specific grief that came back at 2 in the morning regardless of how many books she'd read. The work asked things of her, and she gave them, and the transaction was clean and sufficient, and she was grateful for sufficiency in a season where she'd lost faith in anything larger. She did not think about Jae-hyun, or rather, she thought about him in the way you think about a scar once it's fully formed, aware of it, occasionally running a thumb across the shape of it, but no longer confused about what it is. She was not in love with Min Seok. She was clear about that. She noticed things about him. His patience in meetings, the way he listened with his whole attention in a way that most people perform but didn't actually do. The fact that he remembered small things she said and acted on them without commenting on the remembering. She noticed these things the way you notice the quality of light in a room you spend a lot of time in. It registered. She didn't yet know what to do with the registering. What she did know was that she was not ready. She'd told herself this enough times that it had become a kind of structural support. I am not ready. Something to brace against when the territory between them seemed to shift without either of them moving. She was still holding that support when Sabrina Park walked into the building on a Wednesday in January. Mas, she'd heard the name before Min-suk mentioned it. One of the executive assistants, a sharp-eyed woman named Cho Hyerim, who had appointed herself Amara's unofficial cultural navigator, had said it with the careful neutrality people use when they want to communicate something without saying it. The chairman's sister is returning from London. Adopted but close to the family. She's been abroad for 4 years. Cho Hyerim had looked at Amara with a very specific expression when she said close to the family, and Amara had filed it and moved on. Sabrina Park was 31, Korean by birth, and polished by 4 years of expensive European living, and she entered the executive floor on that Wednesday the way certain women entered rooms, with a prior claim to the space established before she crossed the threshold. She was wearing a coat that cost more than most monthly salaries, and she was smiling the kind of smile that had learned long ago how to look warmer than it was. She walked directly to Min Seok's office. She didn't stop at Amara's desk. She didn't look at Amara's desk. She knocked once on his door and went in without waiting, which told Amara something about the nature of the prior claim. Amara could hear them through the office door. Not words, just tones. Sabrina's voice animated and warm, and Min-suk's measured and polite, in the specific way he was polite when he was being careful. 10 minutes later, Sabrina came out. She pulled the door closed behind her. Then, and only then, she looked at Amara. The look lasted approximately 3 seconds and contained a complete assessment. "You're the new executive assistant," Sabrina said. Not a question. "Yes," Amara said. "Amara, right, Bennett?" She said the surname with a slight pause, the pause of someone who'd already looked it up. "You were married to Kang Jae-hyun." "I was." Sabrina smiled. It didn't reach much past her mouth. "Small world," she said, and walked to the elevator. Amara watched her go. Then she looked back at her screen and resumed what she'd been doing, and made a mental note in the precise, categorical way she made mental notes, filed it next to the names of the 2 executives whose data presentation she'd flagged for Min-suk, and kept working. She should have flagged Sabrina on the first day. She understood this later, that the 3-second assessment had gone both ways, and that Sabrina had walked out of that building already knowing what she intended to do, already having done the calculation, already having determined that Amara Bennett was a problem that needed solving. She didn't know it yet. That was the problem with certain kinds of danger. They introduced themselves pleasantly. The leak surfaced on a Friday, 6 weeks after Sabrina's return. Amara was in a briefing with 3 department heads when Min Seok's legal director, a compact man named Park Dong-woo, who habitually moved as if he was trying not to take up space, appeared in the doorway and signaled. Min Seok excused himself. He was gone 11 minutes. When he returned, his face was fully composed in the way it went fully composed when something was wrong, and he said, "We'll continue this Monday." And the department heads gathered their things and left, and the room was down to Amara and Min Seok and Dong-woo. "Tell her," Min Seok said. Dong-woo looked at Amara with an expression that was apologetic in advance of its content. Confidential client projections from the Busan acquisition, Q3 and Q4 forward models, have been received by a competing firm, Daesung Capital. They've moved on 2 client accounts we were positioned to close. The projections are... He paused. They're detailed enough that the source had executive-level access. Amara felt the room settle around her with a particular stillness. "Who has executive-level access to those documents?" she said. 4 people, Dong-woo said. He looked at his tablet. "The chairman, the CFO, the head of strategic development." He paused. "And the executive assistant to the chairman." The silence that followed was not long, but it was exact. "Me," Amara said. Dong-woo didn't answer, which was its own answer. She looked at Min Seok. He was looking at her with an expression she read immediately and correctly. Not accusation, not doubt, but the expression of a man who was waiting for her to speak before he did, who was giving her the room to speak first. "I didn't do it," she said. "I know," he said. She felt something release in her chest that she hadn't been aware of holding. "You know," she said, "you don't do things halfway," he said. "If you were going to sell projections to Daesung Capital, you would have sold them when they were worth more. And you wouldn't have left a trail." He looked at Dong-woo. "She wouldn't have left a trail." Dong-woo was quiet. "The board is going to require a formal investigation," he said carefully. "Given the access profile, she'll need to be—" "I know what the board will require," Min Seok said. "Start with the access logs. Every document, every timestamp, every device. I want the full chain." Dong-woo left. Amara and Min Seok sat across from each other in the empty briefing room, and the city moved outside the window, and she pressed her hands flat on the table in front of her, because she needed to press them against something solid. "Someone used my credentials," she said. "Yes. Someone who knew what I had access to and when I used it, and wanted the leak traced back to me specifically. She worked through it the way she worked through everything, structurally, from the load-bearing point outward. This wasn't opportunistic. This was planned." "Yes," he said again. "Sabrina," she said. He was quiet. "Min Seok." "I don't have evidence yet," he said. "I'm not asking for evidence. I'm asking if you think it's Sabrina." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. She absorbed this. She has access to the building. She has relationships with the senior staff. She's been in the country 6 weeks, and she knows the internal architecture well enough to... She stopped. "How long has she been watching the company? Before she came back?" Something in his expression shifted. "She asked about the acquisition," he said slowly. "Before it was public. Through our mother. Specific questions about the subsidiary structure." He said it like a man discovering the shape of something he'd been standing inside without knowing it. "I thought she was just being curious." "She wasn't being curious." "No." They sat with that. "The board investigation," Amara said. "Will they suspend me? Temporarily. Pending findings." He said it without flinching, which she appreciated. She needed the truth more than she needed comfort. "It's the correct procedure." "I understand." She looked at the table. "I won't fight it. I'll cooperate fully, and I'll give them everything they need, and we find the real source." She looked up. "But I need you to believe me through this. Not just say you do. Actually stay in it with me." He held her gaze. "I'm already in it," he said. She nodded once. She picked up her laptop. She stood up and straightened her jacket, and she walked to the door and stopped with her hand on the frame. The same geometry as Jae-hyun, she thought distantly. The same doorway position, but entirely different in every way that mattered. "One more thing," she said. The documents that were leaked, the Busan projections, was there anything in them about the Daesung Capital client list? Yes, 3 names. Pull the Daesung access logs for those 3 clients going back 18 months. She turned slightly. Sabrina was in London. She would have needed a contact at Daesung to move on those accounts that quickly. The contact existed before she came back. Min Seok looked at her. Something moved through his expression. Not surprise exactly, but the recognition of a quality he'd already suspected. "I'll have Dongwoo start tonight," he said. She left. Quote, "The suspension came through the following Monday, formal and procedural and cold, in the way institutional documents are cold, stripped of personality by the legal language that surrounded them. She was asked to work remotely pending investigation. She was asked to surrender her physical access card. She did both things without comment, without drama, without the tears that one of the HR coordinators seemed to be faintly expecting, and which Amara had no intention of providing. She worked from the apartment. She slept poorly and worked constantly, and she ate without tasting things, and she took the long walk along the Mappa waterfront every morning at 6, because she needed an hour where her body was doing something and her mind wasn't required to produce anything. The river was cold and flat in the January mornings, and it didn't have opinions about her situation, and she found this restorative. Min Seok sent files. Dongwoo's team was running the access log analysis and the Daesung connection simultaneously, and every 2 days Min Seok forwarded her what they had, and she sent back her analysis within hours, working outside the official investigation in the gray space that neither of them acknowledged directly, but both of them occupied. On the 9th day, she found it. It was buried in a cross-reference that the formal investigation team had overlooked, not through incompetence, but because they were looking for internal actors, and this required looking slightly sideways of that. The Daesung contact had an account at a Mayfair-based investment management firm that had been active 4 years ago, during the exact period Sabrina was in London. The account had a co-signatory that Amara cross-referenced against Von Korea's historical vendor list, and found on page 91 of a contract from 3 years ago, Sabrina Park, listed as a family liaison consultant for a subsidiary that Min Seok had since dissolved. She had been embezzling from the subsidiary, slowly, carefully, in amounts small enough to avoid automated flagging, for almost 3 years. The corporate leak was not her primary play. It was a distraction, something to remove Amara and create chaos during the board investigation while she moved the final tranche of funds from the dissolved subsidiary's dormant accounts before the full audit caught it. Amara stared at her screen. The amount was not small. The amount was, in fact, large enough to constitute a criminal charge, multiple charges, layered across jurisdictions, and it was large enough that Sabrina could not allow the audit to complete its natural course. She picked up her phone. Min Seok answered on the second ring. "I found it," Amara said. "All of it. It's not just the leak. She's been stealing from the company for 3 years, and she needs the investigation focused on me long enough to move the last of it." She paused. "She's going to try to move it in the next 72 hours, before the audit reaches the dissolved subsidiary accounts." Silence on his end, then, "Send me everything." "Already sending." She heard the notification on his end. "Min Seok, she's going to know that we know. The moment you freeze those accounts, she'll know." "Yes." "She's not going to accept that quietly." "No," he said. And his voice had something in it that wasn't quite fear, more like the acknowledgement of a man who knew the person he was dealing with and had just recalculated the radius of what she was capable of. "No, she won't." Amara sat in her apartment on the 14th floor and looked out the east-facing window at Seoul in its cold January mid-morning, and she felt the specific sensation that preceded something bad, the way weather felt before a storm. Not the thing itself, but the pressure change that announced it, the atmosphere tightening around a center that hadn't arrived yet. She was still sitting there, still looking at the city, when her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She answered it. "Ms. Bennett," said a voice she didn't recognize, male, flat, professional in the way of people who were professional about things that weren't professional. "I'm calling on behalf of someone who would like to discuss the investigation with you, in person, tonight." She kept her voice steady. "Who?" "Ms. Park has a proposal she believes you'll find worth hearing. She asks that you come alone." Amara looked at her phone. She looked at the address that came through on a follow-up text, a location she didn't recognize, south of the city, outside the density of the main districts. She sat with it for exactly long enough. Then she sent Min Seok a text with the address and the words, "She's moving tonight. I'm going." His reply came in under 10 seconds. "Do not go alone." She was already putting on her coat when she read his message. She sent back, "I know, come anyway." Then she turned her phone face down on the counter, finished buttoning the coat, picked up her keys, and left the apartment before she could think herself out of it. The cab ride took 40 minutes. She watched Seoul decompress around her as they moved south, the density thinning, the tower blocks giving way to lower buildings, and then to the kind of industrial landscape that cities accumulated at their edges like sediment, storage facilities, logistics yards, the occasional lit window of a business that kept hours no one asked about. The driver didn't speak. The radio played something low and unintelligible. Amara sat with her hands in her coat pockets, and her breathing controlled and her mind running the variables the way it ran everything, systematically, without sentiment, cataloging what she knew and what she didn't, and what the gap between those two things might cost her. What she knew, Sabrina had 3 years of embezzlement about to surface in an audit. She had 72 hours, maybe less, to move the final funds and create enough corporate chaos to obscure the trail. She had identified Amara as the primary obstacle, and she was moving to neutralize that obstacle tonight, which meant she had a plan and the plan was already in motion. What she didn't know, the shape of the plan, the number of people involved. Whether Min Seok would get to that address before or after whatever Sabrina intended to happen, happened. She pressed her thumb against the edge of her key in her pocket. Not hard enough to break skin, just hard enough to feel it. And she watched the streetlights pass and she breathed. The cab stopped at an intersection 2 blocks from the address. She paid and got out and walked the rest of the way. The warehouse was real, not a metaphor, not a dramatic setting chosen for effect, but a working structure that had stopped working, the loading bays sealed with corrugated panels that had rusted to the color of old blood. 3 vehicles were parked outside. A black SUV with the plates angled away from the street, a silver sedan she didn't recognize, and a third car parked at the far end that she clocked without looking at directly. The building had lights on inside. She could see them through the gap in the corrugated panels, diffuse and industrial, the kind of lighting that illuminated everything and flattered nothing. She stood on the street for exactly 5 seconds. Then she went in. The interior was larger than the exterior suggested. The loading floor was cleared recently, she thought, from the way the dust sat in swept patterns at the edges. And in the center of it, under the flat industrial light, 4 folding chairs had been arranged around a portable table with the deliberate functionality of a negotiation. Sabrina was standing to the left of the table. She was wearing a dark coat, her hair pulled back, her posture the same as it had been on the executive floor. Composed, prior claiming, occupying space as a statement. 2 men stood against the far wall. They were large and professionally still in the way of men hired to be large and professionally still. Amara walked to the table and stopped. "Sit," Sabrina said. "I'll stand." Sabrina looked at her for a moment. Then she moved to the table herself and pulled out one of the folding chairs and sat in it with the ease of a woman conducting a meeting she expected to control, which was in itself a piece of information. "You found the subsidiary accounts," Sabrina said. Not a question. "Yes." "And you sent the data to Min Seok?" "Yes." Sabrina was quiet. She looked at Amara with an expression that was doing something complicated. There was anger in it, but underneath the anger was something more structural, something that had been building for a long time before tonight. "How much did you find?" she said. "All of it," Amara said. Sabrina's jaw moved. "You've been in that company 4 months. 5. And you found in 5 months what 3 internal audits missed in 3 years. She said it without admiration, with the flat acknowledgement of a problem correctly identified too late. Min Seok picked well. "He usually does," Amara said. Something sharpened in Sabrina's eyes. "Is that what you think this is about?" His professional judgment. "I think this is about $3.7 million in a Mayfair account and a forensic audit that's going to close around you in the next 48 hours, regardless of what happens in this building tonight." Amara said. I think you're smart enough to know that, and I think that's why you called me here. So, she put her hands in her coat pockets. What's the proposal? Sabrina looked at her for a long time. The two men against the wall hadn't moved. The building was very quiet around them, the particular quiet of industrial spaces, thick and absorptive. You withdraw the findings, Sabrina said. You tell Dongwu's team you made errors in the cross-reference. The subsidiary account analysis becomes inadmissible. The audit goes back to standard procedure and takes another 6 months minimum, by which time the accounts are clean and the trail is cold. She said it the way she said everything, precisely, without decoration. In exchange, I leave the country. I don't come back. Minsuk gets his company without the family scandal. You get your position back without the leak investigation hanging over you. Everyone gets something. Amara looked at her. You're asking me to commit fraud, she said. I'm asking you to make a practical decision. Those aren't different things. Sabrina's expression didn't change. I have documentation, she said, from before you joined Vaughn Korea, your previous employer, the consulting firm in Yowido. There are financial discrepancies in the client reports you filed there, small enough to be overlooked, large enough to be significant if someone who knew what to look for decided to look. The warehouse air was cold. Amara could feel it against her face and in her lungs when she breathed. She stood very still. You fabricated it, she said. The documentation exists, Sabrina said. What it means depends on who's interpreting it and in what context. If this goes to a formal criminal investigation, which it will if you push the audit findings, that documentation becomes part of your profile. And your profile already includes a marriage to Kang Jae-hyun, which means every regulatory body in Seoul is going to look at you twice before they look at me once. She said it without heat. That was the most frightening thing about it. She said it the way she said everything, with the precision of a woman who had planned several moves ahead and was now simply reading from the plan. Amara breathed. You've been building this since before I arrived at the company, Amara said. The fabricated documentation at the previous firm, that takes time. You started preparing this before Min-suk promoted me, before the suspension. She worked through it. You started it before you came back from London. Something moved in Sabrina's expression. Not confirmation, she was too controlled for that, but the small, involuntary adjustment of a person who has been correctly read. You knew he was going to hire me, Amara said slowly. Before he hired me, he told his family about the acquisition. He told you which company. She looked at Sabrina with the particular feeling of a structure becoming visible. He mentioned me. Sabrina's jaw was very tight. He mentioned me to his family, Amara said, and you understood what that meant, not as a business decision, as something else. She held Sabrina's gaze. That's what this is actually about. The silence stretched between them across the folding table and the cold concrete floor, and Sabrina's expression did something that it hadn't done yet. Cracked, slightly, around the precision of it, something raw showing through the gap. He's my brother, she said, quietly, not performing it. He's your adopted brother, Amara said, not unkindly, just exactly. That word doesn't mean what you think it means in my family, Sabrina said. It doesn't mean less. It doesn't mean separate. I grew up beside him. I know him in ways that... She stopped, recomposed. You've been in his life for 5 months. I've been in his life for 23 years. And you walked in with your history and your damage and your sad story, and he rearranged everything around you like you were the first person who ever needed something from him. Amara looked at her for a long moment. I'm sorry, she said. She meant it. Not for what she was going to do, but for the shape of what Sabrina was carrying, which was real even if everything built on top of it was not. Sabrina heard the tone and understood it immediately. Don't, she said. Her voice went sharp. Don't manage me. I'm not managing you. I'm telling you I understand it's not simple. Amara kept her voice even. And I'm telling you I'm not going to withdraw the findings. The men against the wall moved. Not much, a shifting of weight, a repositioning that communicated availability. Amara heard it and tracked it in her peripheral vision without turning her head. Think about what you're choosing, Sabrina said. I have. Min-suk isn't here, Sabrina said. You came alone. I told you to come alone, and you did, which means either you're braver than you should be or you made an error. Or I trusted someone to follow, Amara said. Sabrina looked at his entrance. The silence of the building pressed back at her. Nothing moved. He's not coming, Sabrina said. But something in her voice had shifted. A fraction, a degree. And Amara heard it. Call your men off, Amara said. End this tonight and walk out of here, and whatever happens in the audit, happens. You have money in the Mayfair account. You have a passport. You have options that don't include... Sit down. Sabrina's voice had gone flat. The precision was back. The crack had closed. One of the men crossed the floor. Amara didn't move until he was close enough that moving was a commitment, and then she moved. Sideways, away from his reach, putting the table between them in a geometry that bought her seconds rather than resolution. She knew she wasn't going to fight her way out of a warehouse with two large men who did this professionally. She knew that had never been the plan. The plan was to stay in the room long enough. Sabrina. Her voice came out clear. She was surprised by how clear it was, considering that her heart was doing something percussive and unpleasant against her ribs. Whatever you're thinking about doing right now, think about what Min-suk will do after. Min-suk will be managed, Sabrina said. He always has been. Not about me, Amar said. Not anymore. Something in the air of the room shifted. Then the side door, a service entrance she hadn't clocked on the way in, set into the wall to her left, came open. Min-seok came through it. He was not composed. He was wearing the same jacket he'd had on in the office that morning, no coat, and he'd been moving fast enough that he was breathing through it, and there was something in his face that she had not seen there before. Not the controlled anger from the hospital room, not the careful patience of the office, but something more animal than either of those. The face of a man who had run across a dark industrial yard because the woman inside the building wasn't answering her phone. He stopped when he saw Amara. He looked at her with a completeness of attention that lasted exactly 1 second. She was upright. She was uninjured. She was on her feet. And then he looked at Sabrina. Min-seok, Sabrina said. Her voice was different now, softer. The family register, the 23 years. Let me explain. I heard it, he said. His voice was very quiet. That was the thing she'd learned about him. He went quieter when things were serious, not louder. The quiet was not calm. I was outside for the last 8 minutes. I heard everything. Sabrina's face changed. The controlled surface reassembled itself, but the architecture underneath it was different now. The frame had shifted, and it showed. You don't understand all of it. I understand $3.7 million, he said. I understand fabricated documentation. I understand... He stopped. Something moved through his face. You came back here for this. The whole thing. The return from London, the family dinners, the questions about the acquisition. You came back to cover a trail that was running out of runway. I came back because this is my home, Sabrina said. And it was real. That much was real. Amara could hear it, and she thought Min-suk could too, and she thought that was the particular cruelty of it, that the real thing and the calculated thing had been running alongside each other the whole time, inseparable. Sabrina. His voice broke slightly on the name, the only time she'd heard it break. Why didn't you come to me? Whatever you needed? I didn't need money, she said. Her voice went sharp again. The softness closed like a wound sealing. I needed you to see me. Before her. Before whatever... She stopped. He was going to choose you, Hag, she said to Amara. He was always going to choose you. I could see it from London, from the messages he sent about the acquisition, and the way he described you, and the way he described you again, twice, in the same message, which is something he never does. Her voice was very precise and very controlled and doing none of the things it was covering. I just wanted more time. The two hired men had gone still. They were reading the room the way professionals read rooms, recalibrating, waiting for the power in it to clarify before they committed to a position. Min-suk looked at them. He looked at them the way he looked at people in meetings when he was about to say something that ended the discussion. Leave, he said. They left. It was that simple. The warehouse was down to 3 people and the flat industrial light and the cold and the quiet. Sabrina looked at her brother. Something had gone out of her. Not the composure that was structural, that would be there until she was alone, but the urgency. The forward momentum of the plan. It had encountered something it couldn't move around and had stopped. The police are outside, Min-seok said. Dong-woo called them when I sent him the account documents. He said it without apology, without buffer. I can't stop what happens next. I'm not going to try. Sabrina closed her eyes. 1 second. 2. She opened them. I know, she said. She looked at him. I know you can't. He crossed the floor to her. He stopped in front of her and looked at her for a long moment, and then he put his arms around her and she went rigid. The way people who have been performing for a long time go rigid when someone stops requiring the performance. And he held on, and after a moment she put her face against his shoulder and made a sound that wasn't quite crying and wasn't quite not. Amara looked away. She looked at the corrugated wall and the pattern of rust on it, and she breathed and she let the moment be what it was. Then the main doors opened and Dong-woo came in with 2 officers behind him, and the moment ended. It took 2 hours. She stood outside in the cold while the formal procedures happened inside, statements, documentation, the legal machinery engaging in its thorough, impersonal way. Min-seok was inside for most of it. She watched an officer lead Sabrina to a vehicle and watched the vehicle leave and stood with her arms folded against the cold and her breath making small white clouds in the January air. Min-seok came out at some point after midnight. He walked to where she was standing and stopped beside her, and they stood together looking at the empty lot where the vehicles had been. Are you hurt? He said. No. A pause. You came through the side entrance. I was outside for 8 minutes before that, he said. I heard the men inside when I approached the main doors. I needed a different angle. You came alone. Dong-woo was 30 seconds behind me. She looked at him. He was looking at the lot with his hands in his pockets and his jaw set, and she could see the exhaustion in him now that the immediate necessity had passed. Not physical exhaustion, though that too, but the particular weight of a man who had just watched someone he loved make a choice he couldn't undo for her. She was going to hurt you, he said, not to anyone specifically. I know. I should have. He stopped. You couldn't have known, she said. I should have known. His voice was very even, and underneath the evenness was something harder. I missed it. 3 years and I missed it, and she was inside my house and inside my company, and I... He stopped again, pressed his jaw together. I missed it. She looked at him. She did something she hadn't planned. She took one of her hands and put it on his arm. Just that, just her hand through the fabric of his jacket, steady and without architecture, and she held it there. He looked down at her hand. He looked up. He looked at her with an expression she had no name for yet, something she hadn't seen on him before, or something she'd seen and hadn't been ready to see, which was perhaps the same thing. The audit findings stand, she said. The board reinstates me. The leak investigation closes. Yes, he said. Then we go back to work. Yes. She kept her hand on his arm. The cold pressed around them and Seoul hummed its distant nighttime hum, and the warehouse stood empty and lit behind them. Min-seok, she said. He looked at her. Thank you, she said, for coming through the side door. Something moved in his face, the closest thing to undone she'd seen him, the controlled surface thinning at the edges. Something real showing through with the specific vulnerability of a man who has been holding something carefully for a very long time. I will always come through the side door, he said quietly. She looked at him for a long moment in the cold January dark, his face illuminated by the flat spillover of the warehouse lights, and she felt something she had been keeping carefully at a distance for 5 months. Step closer without her permission, and she did not step back from it. She was not ready. She had told herself she was not ready so many times it had become reflex. But standing in that parking lot with his arms solid under her hand, and the worst of the night behind them, and the city spread dark and glittering beyond the industrial edge of where they were standing, she felt the distance she'd been maintaining. Do something it hadn't done yet. Not collapse, not close, but shift. The way weight shifts when something underneath it finally. The weight shifted and she let it. Not all at once. Not that night. She was not the kind of woman who made large decisions in parking lots at midnight after surviving something, and Min-seok was not the kind of man who would have wanted her to. They stood there until the cold became impractical, and then they walked to his car, and he drove her home and said goodnight at the lobby with nothing more than that. No reaching, no pressing, just goodnight. And she went upstairs, and she sat in her coat on the edge of her bed, and she breathed until her hands stopped their fine, involuntary trembling. She slept for 11 hours, the deepest sleep she'd had in months, dreamless and total, her body taking what it was owed. The weeks that followed moved with the particular rhythm of aftermath, not resolution yet, but the clearing of debris. The Vaughn Korea board convened an emergency session 3 days after the warehouse. Dongwoo presented the full audit findings, the 3-year embezzlement trail, the fabricated documentation against Amara, the Daesung Capital connection, the Mayfair account. He presented it with the careful thoroughness of a man who understood that the family dimension of the case required the facts to be entirely sufficient on their own, which they were. The board sat in their suits around the long table and listened, and the room was very quiet, and at the end of it the chairwoman said, "The suspension of Miss Bennett is lifted, effective immediately, with the board's formal apology." She said it looking at Amara directly, which Amara appreciated. Amara nodded once and said nothing. Sabrina's case moved into the hands of prosecutors. The charges were financial fraud, corporate espionage, and criminal coercion, the last one covering the warehouse, the hired men, the phone call with its flat professional voice. Sabrina retained lawyers and exercised her right to silence, and the machinery of the legal system engaged around her with its slow, impersonal competence. Min Seok cooperated fully with the investigation. He answered every question he was asked without deflection and without using his position to soften anything, which cost him something Amara could see in the set of his shoulders on the days he came back from the prosecutor's office, but which he never once complained about. She did not ask him how he was. She watched him, and she read him the way she'd learned to read him. And when she saw what she saw, she stayed present and adjacent and let him know by proximity that she was there. It was the kind of care she'd given no one in a long time. She was surprised by how naturally it came back. The work continued. That was the other thing. The company kept its momentum. The board's confidence in Min Seok was publicly reaffirmed. The Busan acquisition completed its integration without the complications Sabrina had tried to manufacture. Amara went back to her desk on the executive floor, and the access card was returned, and Cho Hyerim, who had maintained a pointed silence throughout the suspension, welcomed her back with a cup of coffee placed on her desk without comment, which was exactly the right thing. She expanded the Busan risk assessment. She started on the next acquisition in the pipeline. She worked. Life resumed the shape of itself. But the shape was different now, subtly, in the load-bearing places. The distance she'd been maintaining had moved. Go out. Jae-hyun called on a Tuesday evening in March. She almost didn't answer. She looked at his name on the screen for long enough that the call should have gone to voicemail. And then she picked up, because she understood that there was a version of herself that was strong enough to have this conversation, and she needed to find out if she was it. "I heard what happened," he said. "At the warehouse." "Word travels," she said. "I have people who monitor certain channels." A pause. "You're all right." It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. "Yes." "Good." Another pause, longer. She could hear him breathing. That particular rhythm she'd memorized over a decade, slightly slower than most people. Controlled. "I wanted to call earlier, after the board decision. I thought it wasn't my place." "It wasn't," she said. "No." He was quiet for a moment. "Yuna had her child. A boy. He's healthy." He said it without preamble, without framing, the way he said difficult things. Directly, getting the shape of them out of the way. "I wanted you to know, rather than hear it elsewhere." She sat with that. She tested the feeling of it and found it smaller and further away than she'd expected. Not painless, but distant, the way a healed fracture aches in certain weather without stopping you from walking. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I'm leaving Seoul," he said, "at the end of the month. I'm stepping back from the organization. There are people who've been in position long enough to run it without me, and the transition has been in motion for several months." He paused. "It's the right time." She didn't ask where he was going. She understood that the answer would be a deflection, and she didn't need it. "Jae-hyun," she said. "Yes." "The night at the hospital," she said, "when I lost the baby." when you didn't come. She'd said it before in the hospital room, but differently, in the heat of it, with the wound still fresh. She said it now the way you said things after they'd finished bleeding. I need you to tell me you understand what that was. Not sorry. I don't need sorry. I need you to tell me you understand it. The silence on his end lasted long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, I chose her. In that moment, in that specific hour, I chose to stay with her, and I told myself it was because of the bleeding and because of the pregnancy and because I was afraid, and all of that was true. And none of it is why I stayed. He paused. I stayed because I didn't know how to face you, because if I came to that hospital, I had to look at what I'd done, and I wasn't ready to be that person yet, the person who had done that to you. His voice was very even. I understand that I made myself comfortable at the cost of everything you lost that night. I understand it. I'm going to understand it for the rest of my life. She said nothing. That's all I have, he said. I know it's not enough. No, she said. It's not. She breathed. But I believe you. Another long silence. Something in it was the specific texture of 10 years setting down. Be happy, Amara, he said. I mean that without any claim on what that looks like. She looked out her east-facing window at Seoul in its March evening, the city lit and layered and ongoing, indifferent and beautiful in the way only cities can be. I'm working on it, she said. He hung up. She sat with her phone in her hand for a while. She wasn't sad. She wasn't relieved. She was something more neutral and complete than either of those things. The feeling of a door that has been standing open for a long time, finally, quietly, closing. She put her phone down. She went and made tea. She stood at the window and drank it and watched the city, and she was, in the precise and unadorned meaning of the word, okay. Mosque. The conversation with Min Seok happened on a Saturday in April. Not planned. Nothing between them was ever planned. It arrived the way real things arrived, through the accumulation of ordinary proximity. They had developed a habit, over the preceding weeks, of working late on Fridays and walking afterward to a noodle place 2 blocks from the Vaughn Korea building that was small and badly lit and served food that was better than its appearance promised. They sat at the same table each time, and they talked about work and about nothing and about the things in between, and the conversation had been getting longer each week in a way that neither of them had remarked on. On this particular Saturday, Min Seok had asked her to come into the office to review the final documentation for the pipeline acquisition. She came in at 10. They worked through lunch. By mid-afternoon, the documents were complete, and she was standing at the window of his office with a cup of cold coffee she'd forgotten to drink, and he was at his desk, reading through the final page. And the office was quiet, and the city was doing its Saturday version of itself outside, slower and more forgiving than its weekday form. He set the document down. She heard him set it down. She didn't turn from the window. Amara, he said. I know, she said. A pause. You know what I'm going to say. I know what you've been not saying for 5 months, she said. It's the same thing. She turned from the window and looked at him across the office. He was sitting very still in his chair with his hands flat on the desk, and his face open in a way it wasn't open in meetings, in the way it had been open in the hospital room doorway when she'd first seen it clearly. You're not good at not saying things, she said. You think you are. You're not. Something moved in his expression, almost a smile, quickly controlled. No, he said, I'm not. She walked to the desk. She put her cold coffee down on the surface of it, and she looked at him directly. Tell me, she said. Say it out loud, not as a gesture, as a fact. He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light came through the high windows and lay across the desk between them. And the city made its soft Saturday sounds, and he said, I've been in love with you since the first week of university, when you argued with a professor about demand elasticity for 15 minutes and were completely right and knew you were right and didn't apologize for it. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, quietly, without ornament, as if the words themselves were enough and didn't need dressing. I watched you fall in love with someone else, and I made my peace with it because I thought that was what the situation required. I spent 10 years making my peace with it. A pause. I'm done making peace with things that don't deserve it. She looked at him. I'm not the same person I was before, she said. She needed to say it. The person you knew at university, I'm not her. I'm something that went through something and came out the other side, and I don't know yet the full shape of what that is. I know, he said. I can't promise you what I felt for him, she said. I can't promise you that version of it, clean and complete and certain. I don't have that anymore. I'm not asking for that version, he said. What are you asking for? He looked at her steadily. Whatever you actually have, he said. Not a performance of recovery. Not gratitude dressed up as something else. Whatever is actually there as it actually is, at whatever pace it actually moves. He paused. I've waited 10 years. I'm not in a hurry. She looked at him for a long time. Then she reached across the desk and picked up his hand, both of hers around one of his, the way she'd held his arm in the parking lot, but more deliberate than that, more chosen. And she held it, and she looked at what she was holding, and she said, I need you to understand that I'm choosing this with my eyes open. Not because you saved me, not because you were there when he wasn't. I've thought about those reasons, and I've rejected them. She looked up at him. I'm choosing this because when I think about the next 10 years and the 10 after that, your face is the one that comes up. Not as a conclusion, as a preference, my actual preference. She pressed his hand slightly. That's what I have. He looked at her with the expression from the parking lot, the controlled surface thin at the edges, something real and unguarded showing through. And he turned his hand over inside hers and held back. And that was the whole of it. That was enough. They didn't move quickly. That was the thing about them, about what they'd built by accident over 5 months of proximity and parallel work, and the specific trust that comes from being in real danger together and choosing the same direction. They didn't need to rush toward anything because they'd both already spent a long time getting here, and the here of it was sufficient. They had dinner that evening at the noodle place. They talked about the acquisition. They talked about Cho Hiram's ongoing campaign to reorganize the executive floor supply closet, which Min Seok had officially approved and which Amara had privately told her to proceed with regardless of official approval. They talked about Min Seok's mother, who had called twice that week and whose calls he had returned in Amara's presence on both occasions without any adjustment of tone or subject matter, which was itself a statement. His mother came for dinner the following Sunday. Amara had prepared food, not to perform, but because cooking was one of the things she'd returned to in the apartment, a way of making something with her hands that was directly and satisfyingly useful. She'd made 3 dishes, 2 Korean, and 1 from a recipe her own mother had given her, and she'd set the table and she'd been exactly as nervous as the situation warranted, and not 1 degree more. Min Seok's mother was 71 years old and had the posture of a woman who had never once slouched in her life in eyes that assessed things completely before she spoke. She came in and removed her shoes and accepted tea and sat in the living room and looked at Amara for a long moment before saying anything. Then she said in Korean, which Amara's was functional enough to follow, He sent me a photograph of you last year, before you were working for him. He said you were someone he wanted me to know about. Amara looked at Min Seok. He was looking at the table. He did not explain further, his mother continued. He didn't need to. I've seen him describe a great many things over the years, and I know the difference between how he describes something he respects and how he describes something he... She paused, selected. Something he carries. She looked at Amara with the directness of a woman who had run out of time for indirection. You've had a difficult time. Yes, Amara said. And you're not fragile. No. Min Seok's mother nodded once. She picked up her tea. Good, she said. He doesn't need fragile. He needs someone who'll tell him when he's wrong. She looked at her son. He's wrong fairly often. Min Seok said very mildly, I'm right here. I know, his mother said, and the corner of her mouth did something that was clearly the source of his almost smile. They ate. It was not easy, and it was not perfectly comfortable, and there were pauses that required navigating, but it was real. The realness of people feeling their way toward each other without pretending the feeling was something other than what it was. Min Seok's mother ate the dish from Amara's mother's recipe and asked what was in it, and Amara told her, and she said it needed more ginger, which was both correct and the most welcoming thing she could have said, because it meant she expected to eat it again. At the door, leaving, she took Amara's hand. She held it briefly and firmly and looked at her and said nothing, which said everything it needed to. After she left, Amara stood in the kitchen washing dishes and Min-seok dried them, and the apartment was quiet around them with the good quiet of a space that had been filled properly. "She likes you," he said. "She thinks I need more ginger." "That's how she likes people," he said. "She tells them what to fix." Amara handed him a bowl. Their hands touched in the passing of it and stayed a moment before separating, and that was the whole geometry of where they were, adjacent, overlapping at the edges, learning the shape of each other without demanding the shape all at once. Amara called her parents that night. Her mother answered, and Amara could hear the house behind her. The television her father always had on too loud, the familiar acoustics of the home she'd grown up in, the particular presence of a place that held the earliest version of you and kept it regardless of how far from it you traveled. "Baby?" her mother said. Just that. The way she'd been saying it for 34 years, the same word in the same voice, as if the distance between the child and the woman were irrelevant. Amara sat on her couch and looked at the city through the window and said, "I'm okay, Mom. I wanted to call and say that specifically. I'm okay." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Tell me what okay looks like," she said. So Amara told her. She told her about the work and the apartment and the walk along the Mapo waterfront every morning and the plants she'd bought, 4 of them now, all surviving, which she considered a meaningful data point. She told her about Min-seok, carefully and honestly, not overselling and not hedging. She told her about the dinner with his mother and the ginger commentary. Her own mother laughed at that, a real laugh, the kind that released something. "He sounds like a man who stays," her mother said. "Yes," Amara said. "He does." "That's the whole thing, baby," her mother said quietly. "That is the entire thing." Amara thought about the hospital doorway, the parking lot, the side entrance, the hand on the desk, turning over inside hers, the photograph sent before she was hired, 10 years of distance maintained out of something she was only now beginning to understand the full shape of. Not restraint exactly, but respect. The respect of a man who understood that wanting someone did not entitle you to them, and who had waited not passively but actively, at the edges of her life, present and non-demanding, for the moment when she might be free to choose. "I know," Amara said. "I'm starting to understand that." They talked for another hour. Her father got on the phone at some point and told her about his garden and about a trip they were planning and asked 3 questions about Korean winters in the specific way he asked questions about things he was researching in advance of visiting, which meant they were coming, which meant he was already planning to come. And she felt something open in her chest at that. The particular warmth of being anticipated by someone who loved you. After she hung up, she sat for a while in the quiet. The city spread itself outside the window in its nighttime configuration. The lit grid of it, the density, the layers of life moving in their separate currents at this hour, all of it ongoing and indifferent and beautiful. She had come to this city at 22 with nothing but ambition and a scholarship and the specific fearlessness of someone who hasn't yet learned what there is to be afraid of. She had loved it and lost things in it and stayed when leaving would have been easier because there was something in the grain of it that matched something in her. The way certain cities matched certain people in ways that defied rational accounting. She was still here. That was the thing. After everything that had tried to reduce her, the marriage, the loss, the hospital ceiling, the warehouse floor, the suspension, the fabricated documentation, all of it. She was still in this apartment on the 14th floor with her 4 plants, and her east-facing window, and her work, and her morning walks, and the new weight of something real beginning to grow in the careful space between herself and a man who had never once required her to be other than what she was. She was still here, and the still being here of it was not nothing. It was, in fact, everything. 6 months later, on a Saturday in October, Amara Bennett married Lee Min-seok in the courtyard garden of a small venue in Bukchon that held 40 people and had a view of the old city roof tiles going gold in the afternoon light. She wore something simple and her hair natural, and the only jewelry she wore was a pair of her grandmother's earrings, small and old, and belonging to a woman who had also survived things and built things from the surviving, and who was not there in body, but was there in the way the past is always present in the people who carry it forward. Min-seok's mother cried. She did it with the same posture she did everything else, perfectly upright, completely dignified. And she did not comment on the crying, and no one else did either. Minsuk cried once, briefly, when Amara came into the courtyard. She saw it happen. The small private collapse at the corner of his eye, quickly absorbed. And she looked at him walking toward her, and she felt nothing so complicated as a love story. She felt something simpler and heavier than that. The feeling of arriving somewhere after a long route, the specific recognition of a place you've been heading toward without knowing it. Chohayarim attended and wore an aggressively correct outfit, and managed the seating arrangements for 40 people with the same focused intensity she brought to supply closet organization, which Amara had expected and for which she was quietly grateful. Amara's parents were there. Her father took photographs of everything. Her mother held her hands before the ceremony for a long time without saying anything, which was sufficient. The ceremony was short. The words were their own, written separately and read without having shown each other in advance, which had been Amara's idea, and which Minseok had agreed to without hesitation. His words were precise and honest and not long. Hers were also not long. They said what needed saying and stopped when it was said, which was perhaps the most accurate representation of how they operated as two people who had both learned the hard way that the thing itself was what mattered, not the decoration of the thing. He put the ring on her finger. She looked at his hands, which she knew well now, the particular competence of them. The way they were still when he was thinking and expressive only when he didn't realize he was being watched. She knew the rhythm of his coffee order and the books he read twice, and the specific frequency he used when he said her name in conversation versus when he said it, meaning something else entirely. She knew the sound of his footsteps in the office corridor, and the precise weight of his silence when he was angry versus when he was thinking. She knew him. Not completely. You never knew a person completely, and she'd learned the cost of believing you did. But truly, in the parts that mattered, in the load-bearing places. He looked at her through the whole of it, with the expression from the parking lot, from the hospital doorway, from across the desk, the one with the controlled surface thin at the edges, and she looked back and held it, because she was done looking away from real things. 1 month after the wedding, on a Tuesday morning, she came back from her waterfront walk earlier than usual. She sat in the kitchen for a long time before she did anything. Then she got up and opened the cabinet under the sink and took out the pharmacy bag she'd put there 4 days ago and hadn't opened. And she opened it, and she sat on the bathroom floor with her back against the cool tile, and she waited. She was not afraid exactly. She was in a state she didn't have a precise word for. The suspension between one version of things and the next, the seconds of not yet knowing that you can never quite get back. The result came. She sat on the bathroom floor and looked at it for a long time without moving. Then she pressed the back of her hand against her mouth, and she breathed, and she let the shaking come, the way she'd let it come in the street outside Yuna's house. Except this time the shaking was an entirely different thing, arrived from an entirely different direction. She called Min Seok. He picked up on the first ring. He was already at the office. She could hear the building behind him, the slight acoustic of the executive floor. "Come home," she said. A pause. 1 second, 2. She heard him read her voice the way he read everything, completely and correctly. "I'm leaving now," he said. He was there in 22 minutes. She heard the key in the door and his footsteps crossing the apartment, and then he was in the bathroom doorway looking at her on the floor, and she held up the test and he looked at it, and she watched his face go through the same sequence hers had. The suspension, the landing, the shaking held back and then not held back. And he came down to the floor and sat beside her with his back against the tile, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they sat there on the bathroom floor for a long time without saying anything. "I'm scared," she said finally. Her voice was unsteady. She let it be. "I know," he said. "Last time." "I know," he said again. "We'll go to the hospital this morning. We'll know everything there is to know. And whatever it is, we're in it together." He said it without grandeur, just as a fact, which was the only way she could have received it. She nodded against his shoulder. The 4 plants were visible from the bathroom doorway. She could see the nearest one from where they sat, the broad-leafed one she'd bought first, the one she'd been most afraid of killing when she brought it home. It had grown a new leaf in March and another in July, and it was entirely unremarkable and entirely alive. And she had looked at it most mornings of the past several months as a kind of confirmation that things could persist and grow in ordinary light without requiring anything extraordinary of the conditions around them. She looked at it now. Min-seok's arm was solid and warm around her, and his heartbeat was steady under her ear, and outside the east-facing window, Seoul was doing its Tuesday morning thing, the city ongoing and layered and indifferent in its way, and beautiful in that same way, the way things were beautiful when they didn't need you to notice and kept being themselves regardless. She put her hand on her own stomach, carefully, the way you held something that could shatter. And this time, she felt, underneath the fear and the memory and the careful grief of everything that had preceded this moment, something else, something smaller and steadier than any of those things, running beneath them the way a heartbeat ran beneath everything else. The specific, undecorated knowledge that she was not alone, that whatever came next, she was not facing it on a pavement outside someone else's house, with her hands shaking and a photograph folded in her pocket, and the floor dropping out from under her. She was here. She was known. She was held. The woman who had once stood outside a Seoul hospital with an ultrasound photo still warm from the printer, and a heart full of a hope she didn't yet know would cost her everything. That woman had not been wrong to hope. She had been wrong only about who she was hoping with. She understood that now, completely and without remainder. She breathed in, she breathed out. Beside her, Min-seok was warm and present and entirely real. Outside, Seoul kept moving, and inside the still center of it, in a small bathroom with 4 plants visible through the doorway and morning light laying itself across the floor, Amara Bennett Lee held on to the life she had built from the wreckage of the one she'd lost. And she held on to it with both hands, and she did not let go.